On behalf of ArbTech, welcome to our Zoom event, Prosecuting Putin with Open Source Intel. We are finding ourselves in unique, historically unprecedented circumstances. We're witnessing the invasion of a state on a magnitude not seen since World War II. And this war is also unfolding in new and unprecedented ways in the sense that a vast amount of on-the-ground, real-time information and even analysis are openly available online to everyone. This is open source intelligence, OSINT for short. We are seeing, as we have seen in the past few days, international organizations and tribunals being seized with recourses based on public international law from Ukraine against Russia. Our speakers today are looking at these ongoing proceedings and how they stand to benefit from the volume of OSINT currently being collected and analyzed, and also the challenges that they present to the gathering of evidence. Eric Chang is one of the co-founders of ArbTech. He is a principal at Chang Law based in LA. His practice focuses on international investment law and international commercial arbitration. Importantly for our topic today, Eric is also an officer in the US Army Judge Advocate General's Corps Reserve Component, where he currently serves with Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command. He has published several articles on the Russia-Ukraine conflict from the perspective of the law of armed conflict and public international law, notably on the Lawfire blog, hosted by Due Clause Center on Law Ethics and National Security. He has a forthcoming article to be published in the Institute for National Defense Security Studies, and he discusses in that article the topic of Ukraine's use of investment treaty law to counter Russia's incursion into the Ukraine. Chang McCarthy is another co-founder of ArbTech. He's a member of our moderating team as well. He's an Irish barrister, a New York attorney, previously deputy counsel at the ICC Secretariat, currently an ICC YAF representative for Europe. He's a co-chair of the Young Arbitration Practitioners Ireland and a member of Blockchain Ireland Legal Working Group. Chang and Eric have very recently published on Plural Arbitration blog on third-party funding possibilities through crypto, a phenomenon called initial litigation offerings. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. I wanted to say this is being recorded, and also we will most probably follow this up with further written installments. So if there are any questions that arise out of this, do feel free to reach out to us on ArbTech on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for the kind words. I just wanted to note today that I'm speaking in my civilian capacity. So just for good and due form, I'll give the standard disclaimer that the views presented here are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or its components. So with that, I'm going to turn it straight over to Chang to talk about the unprecedented amount and availability of open source information that's being generated in the current conflict. So Chang, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much, Sophie, for the great introduction. So I wanted to just start, when we talk about open source intelligence, as Sophie rightly put it, there's a number of ways to understand open source information and open source intelligence, and I suppose the distinction is probably something that should be made out front. And so we're seeing obviously a ton of open source information, real-time contemporaneous videos, images. We're hearing recordings of unencrypted communications by the Russian army, by the Ukrainian army, etc. We're seeing it all. But it's this intelligence component is actually the analysis. It's the sifting through this raw data and the kind of creation of some kind of valuable insight out of this information that brings in the intelligence component. And allied to that, OSINT is not, or traditional OSINT is not a new concept. it's a concept that really has been around since World War II, and we have seen it much more employed, obviously, by state intelligence agencies. And so the combing of open source information sources such as newspapers, economic data, that has been done for many, many years. But the open source intelligence that we were talking about in today's seminar, and the one that has really much more caught the public's imagination recently, and the public's attention, is open source intelligence done by individuals and by independent groups. And so we'll deal with that later in the seminar, but I think it's a good distinction to make before we start. And so going from there, I want to just kind of bring you through some of the most common objectives that we're seeing of this type of OSINT, and kind of the ways that technology is being leveraged to really kind of not only dissipate the fog of war and give more accurate information from historical journalistic point of view, but it's also the constant battle against mis and disinformation. Misinformation obviously being kind of lazy or uninformed potential use of information, and disinformation being the very much deliberate attempt to obfuscate or to manipulate information to a certain result. And so I just want to then start and use this presentation to give you kind of an insight of the ways that OSINT is being used, and how important it is, I think, as a background, especially to the fourth objective that we'll talk about later, and that's the recording evidence for potential war crimes. So the first objective that I want to talk about is the cataloging of military equipment and losses. And so this first slide is all about cataloging military equipment itself. And in this slide, you can see on the left-hand picture, these are TOS-1 thermobaric rocket launcher vehicles. And these thermobaric rocket launchers are very, very highly destructive munitions that are fired. And basically, they are used in the conventional sense against troop concentrations, against hard points, against buildings full of soldiers. And so the reason for, or the kind of the way in which these rockets explode is they create an aerosol in the air at the exact moment of hitting the target, and they essentially create a fuel air mixture that creates a blast wave that's really horrifically damaging. And so we're seeing evidence, and as you can see in the right-hand picture, of these thermobaric rocket launcher vehicles near population centers. So this is the city of Sumy in the northeast. And so this is kind of the first step in potentially, as I said, going towards the recording of potential war crimes, because we see clear photographic evidence that this piece of equipment is in this area. And therefore, if we saw an attack with the hallmarks of a thermobaric attack on civilians, we could therefore much more quickly and hopefully much more efficiently go and try and find evidence that could tie this attack to actual the use of actual thermobaric munitions. So this is all kind of a background element, but a very important background element from an evidential point of view. And so on the other side of that, we're also seeing the very, very rigorous work by individuals and organizations, and this list and these images are collected by an Oryx, a blog called Oryx. And so they have cataloged every verifiable picture or video evidence of losses of military equipment by both Russia and by Ukraine. And I think it's very, very instructive in kind of seeing a baseline of damage to military units and how they might be able to function in the future. And it's a great way also to have some kind of authoritative sense of and be able to compare between these verifiable losses versus, say, the Ukrainian Military of Defense, and how many equipment losses they're saying that the Russians have sustained. The UK and the US are also doing something a little bit similar in terms of equipment losses and to a lesser extent than the Russian Ministry of Defense themselves. So again, this is, I suppose, in a more journalistic sense, it kind of it tends to try and dissipate this fog of war and show, well, we know that there are documented in an open source point of view this many tanks that the Russian army owns, or there are this many aircraft or this many helicopters, and this many have been destroyed so far. So you get a sense therefore in a verifiable way of how things might be going from that point of view. And so then moving on, another element of this dissipation of the fog of war is the geolocation of battle events. And the reason I wanted to bring this up as well is just the way that technology is being leveraged, especially satellite photography technology, to again give us a more authoritative sense of what is happening on the ground. And so this left-hand picture, or both pictures, in fact, are of an airbase in the south of Ukraine, in Kherson. And there were conflicting reports in the last week of at least one Ukrainian attack on this Russian-held airbase, which may have destroyed helicopters, and that was at the end of last week. And then we heard also in the middle of this week that there was potentially a second attack on helicopters parked there, Russian helicopters. And so this left-hand picture is actually from last week, and it shows some damage to the area that's marked in red. And actually this OSINT account on Twitter hypothesized that it's likely that the helicopters were going to be moved down to the south part of the airbase where the arrow is. And then you can see then a week later, within the last 48 hours, this is actually the result, the verifiable result of this Ukrainian attack. And you can see a number of helicopters have been destroyed. So it really kind of, again, comes back to this combating disinformation and misinformation and propaganda, and gives us a clearer picture of what might actually be happening on the ground. So I think it's again a very important element or background element to the objectives of OSINT. Another element of this, as I said, this technology leverage that's happening, and again very inventive. So this is a satellite image of the Kiev area. And this is taken by a NASA satellite, and it's the NASA FIRMS satellite, and FIRMS is fire information for resource management system. So it was initially designed with an infrared sensor designed to pick up things like wildfires, and obviously a fire source, shall we say, it can be man-made or it can be natural. And in a war zone, obviously, there are a lot of fire sources. And so this has now turned into a very valuable tool to kind of track where explosions, rocket attacks, any potential very intense battle, or even the concentration of equipment with engines creating emissions and creating any kind of heat source. And I think it's a very, very innovative way that this open source information is being used to kind of derive some kind of value and give a clearer picture of what might be happening in real time, or going along with or allied to information that we might be receiving from other sources. And so I suppose as I said, where we're coming from in especially this conflict is a very, very aggressive I would say mis and disinformation campaign by Russia. We're seeing clearly things like the Russian embassy in the UK, clearly Russian government official communications apparatus being used to kind of push narratives that frankly are quite lazy in terms of how loosely they're based on the truth. And I just wanted to kind of show these two examples, which I'm sure everybody has seen. The one on the left being this Mariupol hospital, and the again lazy assertion, I would say personally, that this is some kind of crisis actor, this pregnant lady, and how these kind of narratives, they may not be based in a lot of information, but that this information war is kind of happening in real time and at light speed. And because of that, it's very, very important for other information to be shared also at light speed to kind of combat the insidiousness of this kind of propaganda. And so we see that that example of Mariupol Hospital last week, and then we also see the example this week of this Mariupol theater, and this satellite image was actually taken or released, I suppose, after the fact, after the theater had been bombed, but before the actual picture is taken before it was bombed, as you can clearly see. And what is painted in chalk in front and behind the building is the Russian word for children. And so I think it's this powerful messaging that can kind of be shown by these from these verifiable sources like satellite photography that are also very powerful in combating these false narratives. And so getting, I suppose, to the organizations involved, I don't want to go too much into detail on the Center for Information Resilience, but I did want to kind of delve a little bit into the Bellingcat organization, which is an organization created in 2014 by a British journalist and a former blogger by the name of Elliot Higgins. And it's now Netherlands-based organization, which is very much distributed, and it is funded by a range of democracy building foundations, mostly in the Netherlands, some in Sweden, and some institutions in the EU have funded, I think, in the past. But their mission statement is very, very clear that they are independent. They do not take any funding from state organizations. They only accept from individuals, from intergovernmental organizations and international organizations. And their work, I think, has been very, very powerful. And personally, this is what brought me into this area, is following their investigations of the MH17 shooting down of that airliner during the Crimean and Donbass invasion in 2014, and then, or 2015 rather, and then after that we saw very, very impressive open source investigations of the Skripal assassination attempt and the Navalny assassination attempts, plural. And I think it really shows the professionalism and the rigor that they take their mission as trying to kind of get to the bottom of the attempts by, I suppose, state actors to work in the shadows and to be able to deny, through the use of propaganda or whatever it may be, things that verifiably, based on the evidence produced afterwards, verifiably can be said to have happened and to have been committed by them. So I think Bellingcat is a great organization that people should look into, especially lawyers, to see the kind of the power of leveraging this open source information. And so this map is just one example of some of the initiatives that they're doing in Ukraine at the moment. And this is in tandem with the Center for Information Resilience and another group called CIT. And these are geolocated and chronolocated, so they match to videos and photos of attacks, of other very, very important events that, from a public interest point of view, should be shared and should be obviously catalogued and saved for potential future proceedings. And so this is the kind of power that tech and this open source investigation is bringing to bear on potential future legal actions. And so we see some of these kind of photos, and the rigor that's involved in this kind of because it's not on the ground, and these are active war zones, and it's the work of Bellingcat is very much online. It's not the kind of work, say, that the OCSE might do or might have done in other conflicts. So these are pictures of Russian cluster munitions, both the the tank itself, the rocket assembly itself, and then you see a reference photo trying to match up and say, well, this is the type of munition used. And then in the next slide, you see the actual sub munitions themselves, either unexploded or already spent. And so the physical evidence obviously is there on the ground, but it's the photographic evidence in case of the destruction of this physical evidence that is also very, very important from an evidence building point of view. And so I just wanted to share this, and this is the kind of video evidence that I think it's not only shocking, but it's also of such a high probative value that I think this is where, and I'm sure Eric will talk about this later, that this is where the power of this information is really found, and where individuals and states in proceedings might find this evidence weighing very, very heavily against them. And so I'll just play this. So this is from a car dash cam, and it shows the immediate moment of a cluster bomb attack, and this is in Chernihiv, a city in the north of Ukraine, and it clearly shows the damage and the swathe of damage over a large area of this residential area. And the kind of analysis that's done, and these two pictures on the left are not analysis done by me, but the picture on the right it actually is. So this was the attempt by a person online to geolocate the exact point of where this attack happened. And as you can see, this top left is a screenshot from the dash cam, and the bottom left is a Google Street View, and you can see it's, I mean, almost certainly the same street. And so this picture on the right is then from Google Maps on a satellite view, and this red arrow being the route of the vehicle, and this orange box being the huge area of damage caused by these cluster munitions. And as you can probably,
sorry, Sean, I'm just gonna
sure.
Jump in and just mention that the picture on the right, if because you haven't mentioned it, is kind of a forensic work that Sean himself has done, which is very interesting, and I think it's really relevant too, because it goes to the crowdsourced nature of the analytic part of OSINT. So that was a great job by you, Sean. And I think it shows something interesting that's very relevant and probative, is that we're essentially looking at a civilian neighborhood, right? There's nothing obviously military in the immediate vicinity.
Exactly. And this, I mean, obviously, it doesn't have, say, the rigor that might be needed of evidence in an international legal proceeding, but it is the beginning of it, and it shows, as you rightly say, the kind of the power that the open source information gives you just to put that background evidence together, and being able to be open to anyone to do that. And then I suppose the last point I wanted to make is to talk about the kind of the reliability of this evidence, and Eric will go into much more detail about how evidence is looked at in these international tribunals, specifically the ICC. But this chain of custody, especially for digital evidence, excuse me, especially for digital evidence, is very, very important, and can't be stressed enough, because especially if it's a video that's shared to Twitter or to Telegram, it's very, very difficult to, one, know who the person who took the video is, two, obviously to get the original video from that person, and then three, to kind of know whether it was cut down or manipulated in some way before it was shared to Twitter. And so, yes, the chain of custody after that might be very, very strong once it's saved in a database by one of these open source intelligence organizations such as Bellingcat. But it is a very, very important part, probably the most critical part of the evidential side of this information, is how the chain of custody is kept and the source of the information, and how you might safeguard the chain of custody right from the beginning. And excuse me, and I think something that's very, very interesting is a recent initiative that actually Elizabeth Everson, apologies, brought to us, another ArbTech co-founder, is this this atrocities app, which injects the metadata at the time of the person filming, and therefore will make sure that it's a reliable bit of evidence, bit of digital photo or video evidence from the time that it's recorded, and it's automatically therefore saved and archived in a special place, so that if it were put on Twitter, it might be taken down for breaching guidelines, for being graphic, or whatever it may be, and the public interest of that video might be destroyed before it could be saved. And these kinds of tech initiatives are very, very important to kind of safeguarding the amount and the quality of the information involved. And so just as a final point, I wanted to basically say that, so this infographic that you see, this collect, preserve, process, verify, and investigate, comes from a joint initiative between Bellingcat and a project called Mnemonic, and this is the Syrian archive. And you can see the figures involved, and they're, I mean, huge amounts of data, and how it kind of goes through this funnel of from preservation down to processing, verifying, and investigating. And this mnemonic archive is so important because it is an open source archive, and one that uses very, very rigorous kind of preservation methods, such as attaching metadata and hashing into specific databases, and allows it to be leveraged therefore later on by whoever it may be, from a legal point of view, from a journalistic point of view, and kind of, again, does not let it sit out in the ether and potentially be destroyed and lack the power that it could have in a legal sense. So they're kind of the points I wanted to make, and I think Eric will really delve into the international legal avenues that are already being used, and the ones that are likely to be used in the future.
Thanks, Sean. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I'll just make a quick comment on the OSINT side, that the open source information is not being analyzed just by this crowdsourced citizen army, but there's also obviously international NGOs are getting into the game. So that's Amnesty International, the International Bar Association, which you just mentioned earlier with its new app, but also traditional kind of professional news outfits, right? New York Times has a visual investigations team, Washington Post has its visual forensics team, the Atlantic Council has a digital forensics research lab. Everybody's kind of getting in on this game, and these are traditional. In the latter three examples I gave, these are traditional organizations that have really cleverly pivoted to leverage this wealth of open source information that they themselves don't necessarily generate, right? But that they then sort of analyze, process, and then report upon. So I think that's the use of open source information is kind of being used at sort of various levels, which is quite interesting. So I'll pivot now to talk a little bit about what are the international proceedings that are going on right now, where this open source information, or this OSINT, can potentially be used and presented. So I guess the first point I'll make is that there are a lot of international proceedings right now, a real alphabet soup of proceedings launched by Ukraine against Russia. And this all started back in 2014, following the invasion and occupation of Crimea. So some of the more recent proceedings that you're hearing about in the news are kind of piling on to existing proceedings that have been around since 2014. So I'll focus on just a few. There are several interstate proceedings before the European Court of Human Rights, the ECTHR, and one of the recent applications by Ukraine against Russia was sought interim measures against Russia for alleged human rights violations being committed by Russian troops in the Ukraine. And then at the end of February, on 28 February, the ECTHR granted an emergency interim measure which called for Russia to refrain from further military attacks against civilians and civilian objects. There are also a couple of applications before the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. The earlier one arose out of the 2014 events and involved or related to Russia's supply of arms, financing, and training for separatists in the Donbass region, and which then led to the attack on Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, which Sean had mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of forensic information that was analyzed in that ICJ proceeding. The more recent ICJ proceeding relates to Russia's alleged violation of the Convention on Genocide. And in this application, Ukraine alleges that Vladimir Putin's reason for his casus belli for invading Ukraine was based on false claimed acts of genocide by Ukraine against ethnic Russians in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And further, that it's actually Russia that is planning acts of genocide in Ukraine during this current invasion. So just this week, this Tuesday, the ICJ also issued a preliminary injunction which called on Russia to suspend military operations in Ukraine. For those of you interested in investment treaty arbitration, I will also note that there are some 11, possibly more, treaty claims brought by Ukrainian investors against Russia under the Russia-Ukraine bilateral investment treaty, which allege various breaches of the treaty arising out of the invasion and occupation of Crimea. And if Russia continues to occupy other parts of Ukraine following this current invasion, we can expect that there will be further investment treaty claims in that regard as well. So the upshot of all of this is that the OSINT evidence focusing on the Russian military aggression in Ukraine can be used, and in some cases have already been used in all of these proceedings, right? So even the investment treaty claims can benefit from this. I'll just mention really quickly, a full protection and security claim can rely on all of this OSINT that Sean has referred to demonstrate acts of physical violence by the host state's organs, including its armed forces. So Ukrainian investors can benefit from the guarantee of full protection and security via a most favored nation status clause in the Russia-Ukraine BIT, which kind of brings in the FPS protections, which in turn bring in sort of this this protection against physical acts of violence by the host state. But there are two potential venues where OSINT is going to be most useful, and that's before the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and a special criminal tribunal, a special international criminal tribunal that could be stood up. It hasn't yet, but it could be stood up for the specific purposes of prosecuting Vladimir Putin, as well as his senior aides and potentially senior corporate officers for the crime of aggressive war, or the crime of aggression. I'll turn to the ICC first. The first point to note about the ICC is that Ukraine is not a party to the Rome Statute, which sets up the ICC, but it voluntarily accepted jurisdiction in 2014. And in very recently, just only about 2 weeks ago, the ICC received a really remarkable 39 referrals from ICC state parties to open an investigation into the current situation in Ukraine. And these parties, these countries requested the ICC's prosecutor to look into allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide from 2013 onwards, which thus, encompasses the current invasion. So these 39 simultaneous referrals are really kind of unprecedented in ICC history. And the upshot is it acts to kind of expedite things, and it expedites the ICC prosecutors' investigation. The ICC is important because it's the only organization that has true criminal prosecutorial powers. So even though other organizations like the ECTHR or the ICJ talk about things like genocide or human rights, only the ICC can prosecute individuals as opposed to states. So that kind of highlights the importance of the ICC as a criminal court, right? And there are 4 crimes in principle that the ICC can investigate and prosecute. And I'll quickly go through them because I think they're relevant for this discussion of how the OSINT comes in to prove these elements of the crimes, of each of these crimes. The first is genocide. Article 6 of the Rome Statute then defines genocide as a specific intent to destroy a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group. The second crime is crimes against humanity. That's in Article 7 of the Rome Statute, and it defines this crime as a list of acts committed as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So these acts include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, persecution against certain groups, forced disappearances of persons, the crime of apartheid, and other inhumane acts that are meant to intentionally cause great suffering or serious injury. The third crime is war crimes, and Article 8 defines war crimes as grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949, or Geneva Convention 4, which regulates the conduct of war, right? How armed forces, how a belligerent state's armed forces conduct themselves in war. So breaches include willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment, extensive destruction and appropriation of property that's not justified by military necessity, mistreatment of prisoners of war, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, and attacks against certain protected buildings such as hospitals or theaters, right? So the fourth crime that the ICC can prosecute in theory is the crime of aggression or aggressive war. And the ICC can only prosecute this crime as of 2018. And this was kind of voted on as an amendment, as a kind of a rider to the Rome Statute. And the crime of aggression focuses more on the planning, the initiation, and the execution of an act of aggression or an act of aggressive war, which by its character, gravity, and scale constitutes a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations. So qualifying acts include invasion of a country, bombardment or blockades of a country, attack against the armed forces of that country, and so on and so forth. Importantly, the crime of aggression, which is found in Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute, it states that the crime of aggression must be committed by persons in positions of senior political or military leadership. And that's relevant for purposes of our discussion about OSINT, which I'll discuss in a second. Sort of jurisdictionally, however, the ICC only has jurisdiction for the crime of aggression where both parties concerned are parties to the Rome Statute and have ratified that aggression amendment I just spoke about, or 2, where the UN Security Council refers a matter to the ICC. Now, in this case, Russia has not ratified the amendment, and in fact, only about 35 states out of the 123 or 124 Rome Statute signatories have ratified this amendment. So what these last 2 jurisdictional limitations mean is that the ICC has no jurisdiction over Russia for this fourth crime, the crime of aggression, because Russia is not a state party to the amendment to the Rome Statute, And also because, obviously Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and there is exactly zero possibility that the Security Council will successfully vote to refer the matter to the ICC. So that kind of segues then into this, call for a special international criminal tribunal. The upshot is that right now for the ICC, it can only look at genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, right? And so there currently is a gap as relates to this crime of aggressive war. And this gap explains why there's been a call for a constitution of a special tribunal whose sole focus would be to prosecute the crime of aggression. And just about 2 weeks ago, a group of lawyers, academics, and politicians issued a press release calling for such a special tribunal. And that press release or that call is significant because Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, participated in that effort. And Ukraine now formally backs this idea of a special criminal tribunal. In fact, they may grant their national jurisdiction to this special criminal tribunal, which is important to note. So this tribunal would be patterned after the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which is not coincidentally where the concept of aggressive war was developed. And back in 1947, I think it was brought against 22 individual senior leaders of Nazi Germany. So this special tribunal would really complement the work of the ICC prosecutor, right, who would focus on the remaining 3 charges or crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. What's important for people who support the special tribunal is that the crime of aggression is really important because globally it is easier to establish responsibility for Russia's decision to illegally enter into war as compared with the other crimes under the Rome Statute. So now, how does OSINT fit into all of this? Well, OSINT is going to be useful in all of the other proceedings I've just mentioned earlier, right? But it will, or it is likely to play the most significant role in a criminal prosecution context. But the utility of OSINT is going to be more or less useful depending on which forum we're talking about. So I'll talk about the special tribunal first. As I mentioned, it would only focus on the crime of aggression. And again, this crime focuses on conspiracy, planning, initiation, and execution of an illegal war. More importantly, the crime of aggression is a leadership crime, right? It can only be committed by those with the power to shape a state's policy of aggression, as opposed to sort of the rank and file military personnel who carry out that war. So the war of aggression really focuses on the decision-making process of senior Russian leaders. And that would include Vladimir Putin, of course, would likely involve Foreign Minister Lavrov, his analog in the Nuremberg trials would be von Ribbentrop, and also very senior military leaders and possibly certain oligarchs or senior corporate officers in military-related industries. Again, kind of looking back at the Nuremberg trials, the corporate officers of I think it was IG Farben were prosecuted at the tribunal for development of Zyklon B, which was used in the concentration camps, right? So it's possible that certain oligarchs may be implicated in this or in the ICC proceedings, which I'll talk about in a second. So what this means is that the evidence and of planning and decision making resides largely, not entirely, but largely within Russia and within official state records. And I think that's where, unfortunately, OSINT kind of reaches its limits. So, to refer to the historical analogy of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the evidence of the Nazi planning of World War II really relied heavily on captured Nazi documents after the fall of Berlin, but also contemporaneous statements made by the various defendants. Now, that's not to say that the OSINT will be completely useless in this scenario, right? Because demonstrating the actual execution of a war of aggression can partly rely on everything we've talked about, satellite imagery and so on, but also open source information that captures certain public statements that Putin and other senior leaders have made. So again, in Nuremberg, the prosecutors relied on Hitler's Mein Kampf and his concept of Lebensraum to prove the crime of aggression, right? And to use that analogy, a widely published and publicly available book is kind of the 20th century equivalent of today's tweets or public statements that are captured in digital format, right? So the OSINT is not completely powerless or useless in this scenario of the crime of aggression. But again, because crime of aggression is a leadership crime, a lot of that evidence is going to be held in Russia within government records, which is kind of outside the reach of open source information. So that's the special tribunal, and I'm going to now turn to the ICC proceedings. So in any ICC prosecution, the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, they really focus on Russia's conduct in its military operations within Ukraine, right? So that's jus in bello, whereas crime of aggression is jus ad bellum, right? It's the reasons for going into war. Now with the ICC proceedings, we're focusing on how Russia is conducting itself in the war proper. And that's really where OSINT starts to pay off and be really helpful. So that goes to potential satellite images of mass graves could be relevant, videos of artillery hitting civilian targets like Sean just showed us, and so on and so forth. And on this point, I'll just make a couple of remarks on the ICC's rules on admissibility of evidence. And we don't really have enough time to get into the nuances of all of these evidentiary rules, but I want to focus on the ICC's rule on admissibility of evidence, which sets out a three-part test. Number one is relevance, number two is probative value, and number three is absence of prejudicial effect. And I want to focus on the second prong of probative value, because that focuses in part on the reliability of the evidence. And this in turn raises the issue of provenance, or what we call in the US, chain of custody. And this is where a lot of that analytic work being done by various organizations comes into play. So organizations like Bellingcat that Sean mentioned, or Amnesty International has its Citizen Evidence Lab efforts. Sean had mentioned the IBA's efforts. They've got that fascinating mobile app called Eyewitness. And what that does, again, just as Sean had mentioned, it allows users to record videos, which as it's recording is embedding the metadata that's needed to demonstrate authenticity to a court. And the way that it transmits and stores the footage creates a robust chain of custody, right? So at the back end, the IBA catalogs that, processes the footage, specifically with the purpose of submitting it to international tribunals or national investigators, as the case may be. So these OSINT efforts are really focused on things like preserving metadata, corroborating video evidence, geolocation, multiple angles of the same event, tracking down identity sources of the information, and just demonstrating that the evidence is authentic and hasn't been digitally tampered, right? And all of these efforts are specifically anticipate the need to demonstrate provenance, chain of custody, reliability, and ultimately the probative value of the evidence in a court setting. So on this point, the ICC case law, if we look at it really quickly, shows that tribunals have been, the ICC tribunals in the past have been kind of slow to come into the 21st century, and they haven't been as, they haven't adopted or dealt with digital evidence as quickly as national courts have, right? But here, I'm going to make a prediction, which is that if the ICC ever does prosecute Vladimir Putin and other Russian leaders for the invasion or the war in Ukraine, what I think we're going to see is probably the most intensive use of digital evidence, open source and otherwise, in the history of any criminal proceeding. And what we're going to see is the ICC start to really trailblaze in this evidentiary area. What is that going to look like? I think it will probably look something, it'll be analogous to what we've been seeing here in the US in the federal prosecutions that arose out of the January 6, 2020 insurrection at the Capitol in Washington, DC. And those prosecutions have relied heavily, really heavily, on public statements made on social media by various defendants, and publicly available video footage that was taken on the day of event, and in some cases, again, by the defendants themselves. And then, of course, marrying that with non-OSINT sources like CCTV footage, cell phone tower, pinging records that triangulate and can locate defendants at a certain place at a certain time, right? So what we've seen in these federal prosecutions here in the US is a very savvy use of this vast amount of open source information that was put out there, again, in some cases by the defendants themselves, and used to harness that information and used it to prosecute the various defendants. So I would expect that we would see something like that in any ICC proceeding against Vladimir Putin and other Russian senior leaders. So as a concluding remark, I think what we can say is we're really in sort of uncharted territory or in uncharted waters right now. And we are in a series of converging and unprecedented events, right? There's the underlying war in Ukraine, as Sophie had mentioned, absolutely unprecedented. It's the biggest military land invasion since World War II, the biggest invasion military operation since in 80 years, right? It's also, as Sean has mentioned now, the first time in a major military conflict that is generating real-time information, open source information, and it's generating the sheer quality and quantity of open source information that's never before seen. And finally, we've got this really fascinating possibility that we could be at some point in the future seeing an international prosecution of Vladimir Putin and his senior aides before the ICC and or before a special international criminal tribunal. So the convergence of these three points is, it's just really extraordinary from a legal point of view, a historical point of view, a military point of view, and of course a political point of view. So really uncharted territory. And that completes my remarks. Sean, do you have anything you want to add?
Thank you, Eric. No, I think you've absolutely summed it up perfectly. And the only thing I would add, and we discussed it yesterday very briefly, but I do think that this might be the turning of the tide in a certain sense against leaders, dictators, democratically elected presidents, prime ministers, etc., and kind of shows them that their decision making, especially with the use of force, will now attract a different kind of responsibility, an increased responsibility, and it will not allow them to use propaganda, use media narratives to escape this. And I think that this hopefully is where we see the trove of open source information finally kind of almost in a democratic type way, that it democratizes the responsibility of everyone and especially leaders in the use of force, and hopefully holds them accountable for their actions.
Yeah, Sean, and I'll just jump on that really quickly. What I find fascinating is especially the concept of war of aggression, right? Because we're confronting two completely contradictory situations where Putin is making repeated assertions of Nazification of Ukraine, crimes against genocide against Russians in the Donbass, So these statements by the leader of Russia confronted with the evidence that we're seeing that's coming out of this, and so it like you said, it's really dissipating the fog of war, right? Where in the 1938 or 1939, you could see these kinds of statements as being really difficult to confirm or deny. Nowadays, with the sheer quantity and quality of the OSINT, it makes for a very it makes these statements, it really highlights these statements and kind of puts them on under a very harsh light, and it just makes it really harder, I think, for leaders to make these kind of casus belli, these very casual casus belli arguments that are not really backed in fact in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you very much. Absolutely riveting stuff. And I expect that the ICC proceedings will be public, so we will be able, hopefully, to see in real time the use and how it's deployed of the OSINT and intelligence and online and open source information. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, and until our next event.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, John. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much to both of you. Bye.